March 18, 1944. Northern France. The air was still, the kind of stillness that only came before something broke. A low drone cut through the morning haze. Allied P-47 Thunderbolts returned from another dawn raid over German lines, some trailing smoke, others riddled with holes. One fighter in particular came in crooked, sputtering like a dying engine, choking on its own fumes. The landing gear barely held. The wheels hit the makeshift runway at an angle, kicking up mud and dust, the left wing scraping the edge of a fuel truck before skidding to a stop in a nest of sandbags. Two officers stepped onto the strip. They didn't need clipboards to know what they were seeing. The nose was scorched, cowling cracked, air intake bent out of shape, one of the wing spars visibly warped. "She's done," one muttered. "Strip her and mark the frame for salvage." They turned away, but someone didn't. A silhouette moved from the edge of the tarmac. Goggles slung around his neck, sleeves rolled up, face smudged black. TSgt Eddie Scrap Harrison. Known across the field not for his medals, he had none, but for one thing, making broken planes fly. He walked up to the mangled P-47, ran his palm along the bent paneling, and tapped his knuckles twice against the buckled intake pipe. It rang hollow, but not dead. "Nope," he said under his breath. "Not yet." That night, while others slept in tents or played cards by oil lamp, Harrison went to work. Not in the hangar, that was for authorized repairs. He worked behind the fuel depot, in what the crews jokingly called the boneyard. It was a twisted field of wreckage, crumpled fuselages, blown-out jeeps, even a few German aircraft hulks that had been dragged in for study and left to rust. For Harrison, it was a gold mine. He dug out a curved section of armored plating from a wrecked M8 Greyhound, cut it down to size with a manual hacksaw, then heated it with a blowtorch to mold a replacement intake panel. The P-47's cowling had torn free mid-flight, too damaged for rivets. So he fused the replacement using heat-welded steel supports scavenged from a Nazi anti-tank gun's trail legs. The entire left engine mount had bent inward during the landing. Harrison jacked up the aircraft using a log and fashioned a counterbrace out of tank tread plates and a modified tow hook from a ruined half-track. Each component was hand-fitted with a set of clamps he'd originally built to fix a tractor suspension back in Iowa. At 2:41 a.m., one of the junior crewmen wandered by and stopped dead. "You building a monster or a plane?" Harrison didn't look up. "Both." By 4:30 a.m., the new intake system was fitted. The welds glowed faintly in the torchlight. It wasn't pretty, it wasn't regulation, but it held. He tested it twice with manual crank starts, then rigged a bent control rod as a brace for the damaged undercarriage. At sunrise, Lieutenant Reiner, the original pilot, showed up in disbelief. "You serious?" he asked. "You want me to fly that?" Harrison tossed him a helmet. "You want to walk to Berlin?" An hour later, the aircraft was airborne. She didn't fly smooth. She flew angry, but she flew. What happened next turned Scrap Harrison from a joke into a whisper. The P-47, now unofficially christened Rusty Demon, returned 3 hours later, barely scratched. 2 confirmed kills, 1 Focke-Wulf 190, 1 Me-262 jet, the first jet kill by a modified P-47 in the unit's record. The pilot climbed out, stunned. The officers, who had laughed, said nothing. The only sound was a mechanic whistling low, looking at Harrison's welds. A note appeared taped to the Demon's tail fin later that day. "She flies on grit and guts. Next time, don't throw her away." And from that moment on, no one called him crazy again. War favors structure. Structure breeds manuals, and manuals dictate obedience. By 1944, the U.S. Army Air Forces ran on doctrine. Procedures, inspections, certifications. Everything had a form. Every decision had a signature. If a bolt wasn't torque tested to spec, it was red tagged. If a fighter came back with unauthorized mods, it was grounded. And if a mechanic like Eddie Scrap Harrison tried to explain his repairs with the words, "It just felt right," the response was automatic. suspension, inquiry, disciplinary review. The official belief was simple. Air superiority came from the top, from engineers in Wright-Patterson, designers in Lockheed and Republic, factories in California and Michigan. Maintenance crews were to follow the chain. No deviations, no field improvisation. And yet, that was the lie. The frontline truth was messier. Factory parts arrived late. Replacement kits were incomplete. Modifications were denied even when aircraft needed them to survive. Officers kept quoting design specs. Meanwhile, mechanics were hammering bent sheet metal into survival gear. You couldn't wait 10 days for a new cowling when your squadron had to fly in 4 hours. Doctrine didn't save lives out here. Duct tape and scrap steel did. But even among mechanics, Harrison was considered a risk. He didn't just bend the rules, he treated them as suggestions. Where others saw equipment, he saw systems. He didn't ask what a part was supposed to do, he asked what else it could do. Cowling bolts became tension springs. Tractor axle casings became reinforced air ducts. His first major field mod had been laughed at, until the engine ran 20% cooler. Still, higher-ups labeled him as non-standard. His paperwork was riddled with warnings. One CO described his workshop as a hazard to regulation and uniformity. Another wrote, "He knows machines, but he doesn't respect procedure." They were both right. Harrison didn't care about regulation. He cared about one thing: uptime. Could the plane fly? Could the pilot come home? And when the first Harrison-modded P-47 took down an Me-262, people began to reconsider the chain of innovation. That kill wasn't supposed to happen. On paper, the P-47 was too heavy, too slow, too clumsy to dogfight a jet. But Harrison's intake mod, an airflow adjustment built from a ruined oil drum and reinforced with Jeep suspension clamps, had boosted power output by 9%. It let the pilot climb higher, dive faster, and punch back harder. When the Me-262 came in for a pass, the Thunderbolt didn't break. It bit back. That wasn't in any manual. For decades, the mythology around World War II focused on the big machines, the streamlined designs, the engineers in white coats. But what history forgets is that without field mechanics like Harrison, half those aircraft wouldn't have flown. The misconception that only the cleanest, most polished designs won the war is a comforting lie. It lets us believe war is tidy, heroic, engineered. But in truth, war is ugly. War is bolts held together with wire and plates hammered into shape with crowbars. It's men like Harrison working by moonlight, welding intake manifolds from old tank hulls because the supply depot is 300 miles behind the front. And the cruelest part? He got no credit. No one logged his mods. No one wrote his name in the after-action reports. They noted the kills, the engine output, the performance, but not the wrench that made it possible. Because the myth said engineers win wars. But the truth? Sometimes the man in the mud, with no rank, no blueprint, and no orders, builds the machine that kills the jet. The P-47 Thunderbolt was never meant to be pretty. It was a beast, thick-skinned, broad-shouldered, weighing in at over 10,000 pounds when empty. Nicknamed the Jug, it could outdive any fighter in the sky and take more punishment than almost anything flying. It was fast in a straight line, lethal in a dive, and nearly immune to small arms fire. But under battlefield conditions, its ruggedness came at a cost. Field crews knew what the design specs didn't say. The Thunderbolt's air intake was overly complex. The turbocharger piping ran hot, often overheating under sustained climbs. The cowling was difficult to align after even minor nose damage, and once the intercooler ducts bent, airflow efficiency dropped drastically. Factory tolerances were tight, but on the battlefield, one bent bracket meant the difference between a clean burn and a blown engine. And replacements? They didn't arrive on time. By spring 1944, Allied supply lines were stretched across continents. Crates marked for frontline repairs ended up in rear depots. Mechanics waited weeks for new engine mounts, turbo clamps, and intake assemblies. Meanwhile, damaged fighters piled up near hedgerows and canvas shelters. their fuselages nicked with bullet holes, their inner systems clogged with dirt, grease, and cooling fluid. This was the gap. The Thunderbolt was a world-class aircraft, on paper. But in the real world, between missions, surrounded by wreckage and under constant pressure, it faltered. Ground crews had no time, no parts, and no margin for failure. Eddie Harrison saw the problem differently. Before the war, he wasn't a military man. He was a farm mechanic from Nebraska. No college, no factory job. Just hands-on work. Harvesters, grain trucks, diesel tractors. If a part broke on the farm, you didn't wait for a shipment. You fixed it with whatever you had. That same instinct came with him to Europe. His first major intervention came after a P-47 returned from a recon run with cracked intake supports. The pilot grounded it, the officers logged it, and the parts requisition sheet went out. 3 weeks ETA. Harrison didn't wait. He walked behind the hangar, pulled a suspension rod from a wrecked half-track, reshaped it using a hammer and heat, and welded it into place. The aircraft flew again that afternoon. That moment changed everything. From then on, Harrison treated every damaged plane like a broken combine back home. He stripped parts from crushed fuselages, reinforced cracked intakes with field-forged braces. When the rubber cowling seals failed, he melted down parachute rigging clamps and recast them into custom fittings. The goal wasn't beauty, it was survival. In one case, he cut a section of damaged B-17 wing to form a makeshift vent for a P-47 intercooler, a vent that actually reduced engine temps by 11% during sustained climbs. Another time, he repurposed a German shell casing as a stabilizer bracket. It worked better than the original part. At first, the officers grumbled. They didn't like the look. Exposed welds, irregular shapes, foreign metals. It made their planes look unofficial. But the results spoke louder than regulation. Planes that should have been grounded flew again. Missions that should have been scrubbed went ahead. Pilots started requesting the guy with the goggles when their birds came back limping. This wasn't innovation in a lab. It was survival engineering in a war zone. And Harrison's real gift wasn't just improvisation. It was seeing the system. He understood how airflow, heat, vibration, and torque all worked together. He didn't just slap on parts. He redesigned function using scrap. The P-47 was built to win dogfights. Harrison made it win wars. In war, numbers don't lie. And by early 1944, the math wasn't looking good for the Allied air war. Not at the front lines, not in the hangars, and definitely not on the mission boards. For all the power and pride behind the P-47 Thunderbolt, its raw numbers told a different story. Downtime, disruption, and death by delay. At full operational tempo, a single fighter group could push up to 240 sorties per week. But due to maintenance backlogs, an average of 28% of aircraft were grounded at any given time, waiting on parts, tools, or technician clearance. That meant nearly a third of potential air power sat idle, engines cold, while Luftwaffe jets prowled the skies. The average repair turnaround for a damaged Thunderbolt? 11.6 hours. That's assuming clean damage and a stocked parts bin. But in reality, parts delays stretched timelines to 2 or 3 days, or indefinitely, if components were destroyed in transit or rerouted by mistake. One squadron recorded 17 aircraft waiting on a single part, a mounting bracket for the turbo intake, for over 6 days. In that time, the unit lost 3 bombers due to under-escorted missions. Now compare that to the Me-262. The German jet wasn't perfect. It suffered from fragile engines and short flight times. But its speed was revolutionary. And when it flew, it killed. From August 1944 onward, Allied pilots reported Me-262 strikes increasing by 36% monthly, with kill rates per sortie doubling. Jet fighters didn't need to match numbers. They just needed to show up. And with grounded Thunderbolts littering the fields, Allied air response became slower, thinner, and more desperate. This is where Harrison's math hit like a sledgehammer. Using nothing but scavenged materials and field-rigged jigs, his repair times averaged just 4.7 hours per aircraft, less than half the standard. On top of that, his mods, particularly his reinforced intake system and modified intercooler duct, increased engine reliability by 21% based on mission reports. That meant fewer vibration warnings, fewer emergency returns, and more pilots willing to fly hard. One squadron commander even logged a note. Harrison's unit gets planes flying in less than half the time. Fighter availability has jumped 20% since his junk shop mods became standard procedure. But the most brutal number came on March 19, 1944. 3 Harrison-modded P-47s took off in rotation, Rusty Demon among them. In under 24 hours, those planes accounted for 3 confirmed jet kills. Not near misses, not assists. Full takedowns. Official records showed 0813, FW-190, downed over Bois d'Arcy, 1227, Me 262 intercepted over Chartres, 1742, Me 262 disabled in retreat near Dreux. Each aircraft had been flying with a Harrison-fabricated component. Each had originally been scheduled for grounding. 3 kills in one day, by planes built from discarded parts. The shock rippled up the chain of command, not because of the kills, those happened often, but because of the aircraft doing the killing. Each had been deemed unflyable days earlier. Each had received field repairs outside standard protocol. Each had parts that didn't even exist on official manifests, and yet they worked. That day, a mechanic with a blowtorch and no authorization outperformed factory precision, official engineering, and military doctrine. The numbers didn't just hurt, they humiliated. Because Harrison didn't just prove scrap could fly. He proved that the biggest enemy wasn't the jet. It was the lag between damage and decision. March 12, 1944. 6 days before Rusty Demon's legendary run. A different aircraft rolled back from a mission over Rouen, shaking like it had a fever. The pilot, Lieutenant Freeman, couldn't explain it. The engine had power, but every time he pushed above 6,000 feet, it growled like it wanted to quit. Upon landing, the crew chief flagged it for turbo issues. Maybe an intake crack, maybe something worse. The manual said ground it. Eddie Harrison said otherwise. Inspection revealed the problem immediately. The left turbo mount had sheared along one edge. A fatigue crack, weeks in the making. Normally, it would mean a full disassembly. Parts weren't just unavailable, they weren't even on the continent. The depot at Le Havre had been bombed 2 nights prior, and rerouted cargo wouldn't arrive for at least 5 days. 5 days of silence from a perfectly good fighter. Harrison refused to accept that. He radioed nothing, filed nothing. Waited until nightfall, then rolled the bird back behind the second hangar where the graveyard waited. There, amid the carcasses of burned-out transport trucks and shattered propeller blades, he hunted for a donor. What he found was absurd. A cracked Jeep drive shaft, long enough, thick enough, and heat-treated. With careful grinding and reinforcement, it could serve as a turbo brace. Not standard, not tested, but potentially strong enough to hold under flight pressure. He cut the shaft, filed its ends, and ran a blowtorch until the metal glowed orange. He shaped it using a spare ammo box and the undercarriage of a collapsed Kubelwagen. By 03 Hunquois, the new brace was clamped and tack-welded in. He gave it a hard shake. It didn't move. That should have been the end. But the aircraft had another flaw. The intercooler vent system had warped during its last dive. The cooling airflow was blocked. Harrison fashioned a new set of ducts from a wrecked MG ammo crate, slicing the steel, rerouting the bends and bolting it using radiator clips. It wasn't streamlined, it wasn't clean, but it would move air. At 0511, Lieutenant Freeman arrived, groggy, holding a mug of powdered coffee and a raised eyebrow. "I thought they grounded her." "They did," Harrison muttered. "I didn't." Freeman ran a hand along the modified bracing, looked at the unfamiliar ducts. This even safe? Nope, just better. Against orders, Freeman climbed in and started her up. The engine didn't growl. It snarled, full-throated and clear. The turbo hissed cleanly. The exhaust temperature stayed even. The controls felt lighter. The aircraft launched on a test pass just after sunrise, banking hard over the nearby tree line. Ground crews watched, stunned, as the plane looped, climbed, dove, and held together flawlessly. When Freeman landed, he taxied to Harrison, cut the engine, and shouted, "Feels like she was reborn." The aircraft flew combat the next day, killed one FW-190 and returned with 0 issues. Word spread fast. Not just about the MOD, about the method. Harrison wasn't guessing. He was mapping stress points, predicting airflow, measuring flex not with digital sensors, but with calloused fingers and gut feel. The command response? Mixed. One officer filed an anonymous report condemning the unauthorized structural substitution. Another simply wrote, "Pilot returned alive. Consider results." The moment mattered. It was proof. Proof that real war doesn't wait for parts. It waits for courage, skill, and someone crazy enough to weld a solution at 3 a.m. By April 1944, Harrison's name had started circulating beyond his airstrip. Not in official memos or command briefings, those still listed his modifications as non-compliant repairs. But among pilots, ground crews, and supply sergeants, his reputation grew like wildfire. Men stopped calling it scrap welding. They called it Harrisonizing. The reason was simple. His math worked. Cold, brutal, undeniable. Each fighter squadron had a theoretical sortie rate, the number of missions its aircraft could fly per week under perfect conditions. For P-47 units, that rate hovered around 220 to 250 sorties weekly, but field conditions made that impossible. Damage, weather, crew exhaustion, and worst of all, waiting on parts. Across multiple squadrons, the average actual sortie rate was barely 62% of capacity. That gap was fatal. What Harrison introduced wasn't just repair speed, it was system collapse, in the best way. His modifications didn't just fix planes. They bypassed the parts delay entirely. Once his first brace and intercooler mod passed 3 missions without failure, word spread. Other mechanics started copying. At first it was informal, a diagram scribbled on a mess hall tray, a torch borrowed for 20 minutes. But soon, Harrison began putting together full replication kits. 5 core pieces: intake template, turbo brace jig, duct angle guide, mount harness pattern, and weld stress checklist. All made from scrap, all adjustable depending on the donor parts available. Within 2 weeks, 9 separate squadrons were using versions of his mods. Within 2 months, 27 squadrons, some stationed 300 miles away, had requested the Harrison kit. And the impact? Sortie rates rose by an average of 18% across units using the system. Engine failure reports dropped by 23%. Pilots began requesting Harrison-modded birds specifically before dangerous runs. One mission planner noted that the planes with the ugly welds kept coming back. The Air Force had no official term for what was happening. They couldn't. These weren't factory updates. There were no serial numbers, no formal approval process. Harrison's toolkit was untraceable in the logistical database. But to the pilots, it was as critical as fuel or guns. His mods even began influencing battle planning. Field commanders realized that a Harrisonized squadron could be pushed harder, faster turnarounds, less downtime, more redundancy. On one occasion, a wing commander redirected a bombing run simply because we had 2 of his birds in rotation. And it wasn't just the planes. Harrison's work changed how mechanics thought. Instead of waiting for approval, they started solving. Instead of logging delays, they logged adaptations. Creativity became currency. The war was still brutal, but for once the battlefield advantage wasn't in numbers or factory output. It was in initiative. By late spring, a quiet revolution had overtaken frontline maintenance. Not because the command structure changed, but because the people in the mud changed the game themselves. The supply chain wasn't just bypassed. It was rewritten on the ground by men who refused to lose another plane to paperwork. And Harrison? He never asked for recognition. He kept building, kept refining. Found that using a German MG barrel sleeve cut in half made for a perfect intercooler vent on certain nose configurations. Discovered that Jeep suspension plates could outlast factory brackets when braced correctly. His mind was part calculator, part blacksmith, part daredevil. The numbers were no longer on the engineer's side. They belonged to the man with the torch and the guts to weld a better way into existence. March 19th, 1944. Dawn broke cold and uncertain. A low fog rolled over the forward strip as generators coughed awake and pilots clutched steaming tins of coffee. The mood was heavy. 3 bombing runs scheduled, enemy air activity rising, and worst of all, 2 Me-262 sightings the day before. Jet sightings meant something very specific, casualties. But on this day, the mission planners had a surprise. 3 P-47s, recently modified, were back in rotation. All had been grounded just days before. All had been Harrisonized. Among them, the infamous Rusty Demon, now bearing fresh kill markings. 1 jet silhouette, 1 prop fighter. Her skin was patched like a quilt, her intakes glinting raw metal under the frost. Nobody called her pretty, but everyone knew she was fast. Lieutenant Reiner was assigned to her again. He didn't argue. "She saved my ass once," he muttered. "Let's see if she can do it again." 08:13 hours. The squadron launched into gray skies. Their mission, bomber escort toward the rail yards outside Bois d'Arcy. At 12,000 feet, they spotted the first German formation, 4 FW-190s, and trailing behind, a Me-262 climbing into position. Reiner didn't wait. He peeled off from the escort and dove straight into the FW-190s. The Rusty Demon responded like a bloodhound. Her modified intercooler kept the engine from choking, even in the thin air. She burst through the enemy pack and nailed the trailing fighter with a short burst. 1 down. Then the jet came in. The Me-262 screamed past faster than anything Reiner had ever seen. But this time, he didn't try to outpace it. He used the Demon's reinforced intake boost, a trick of airflow physics Harrison had baked into her bones. In the climb, it gave her just enough torque and throttle response to break into a reverse dive. 12:27 hours. He pulled up at the exact angle the jet curved to re-engage. The P-47's 850 cal guns lit up. The jet's right engine exploded in a spray of magnesium and black smoke. 2 kills. When he landed, Reiner said nothing, just walked over to Harrison and nodded. "Your Frankenstein's got bite." But the day wasn't over. 17:42 hours. An emergency call came in. Another Me-262 was sighted harassing the third wave of bombers retreating from Dreux. Only 1 fighter was ready in time to intercept. Another Harrisonized P-47, this one with field-modded rudder plates and a bent intake system patched with German shell fragments. Lieutenant Andrews climbed in. He was young, green, and nervous. The command officer warned him, "You don't have to take this." He looked at the plane, looked at the sky, and said, "If Harrison built it, I'll fly it." 10 minutes later, Andrews intercepted the Me-262 mid-turn. With the added stability from the modded rudder and smoother power ramp-up from the reinforced intake, he outmaneuvered the jet in a wide loop and shot it down with a textbook deflection burst. 3 jets, 3 kills, 1 day. The after-action report flagged each kill, noted the pilots, noted the locations. But the common detail? All 3 aircraft were declared previously unserviceable. All had received field repairs marked temporary. All had non-standard components installed by Sergeant Harrison. And the kicker? Each pilot returned without a scratch. The officers reviewed the records. Quiet meetings were held. One colonel finally said aloud what others whispered. "He's winning battles with garbage." They still wouldn't give Harrison a medal. But that day, 3 enemy jets fell to patchwork machines powered by scrap steel, raw nerve, and one man's refusal to accept broken as final. April 7, 1944. The mission was textbook. A flight of B-17s, 42 strong, was set to cross into southern Germany to strike a ball-bearing plant near Augsburg. Standard protocol called for layered fighter escort, Thunderbolts covering the first half, Mustangs sweeping in after refuel. The path was charted, the timing aligned. Everything was perfect on paper. Then, as always, the paper caught fire. 20 minutes before takeoff, 2 of the assigned P-47 escorts were pulled for engine issues. One had a cracked turbo pipe, the other a cooling duct failure. With enemy air activity spiking, that loss meant a thin escort window during the critical early phase of the mission, exactly when the bombers would be climbing, slow and exposed. Panic buzzed through the command tent. There were no spares cleared, no rotation backups, but Harrison was already moving. One of the grounded P-47s had been sitting in a holding loop for over a week. The turbo intake had failed catastrophically on landing. The duct sheared from its mount, coolant everywhere. The damage had been logged as non-repairable without depot parts. Harrison ignored the tag. He grabbed 2 assistants and wheeled the aircraft behind the maintenance tent. With a welding torch in one hand and a Jeep axle in the other, he crafted a replacement duct brace from raw scrap. His assistant, Corporal Nunez, later recalled, he was muttering about airflow like it was a sermon, said if the curve was wrong, the engine would choke in the climb. They worked for exactly 22 minutes. No diagrams, no guidance, just instinct, experience, and adrenaline. The final build was Frankensteinian. An intake brace clamped by repurposed artillery mount bolts and a vent system made from a reshaped ammo box lid. When they started the engine, it roared clean. No sputter, no overheating. By the time the pilots were briefed on the new route, the modified fighter had already completed engine checks. No one even asked how. Lieutenant Daniels, the escort pilot assigned to the aircraft, walked up, saw the raw welds, and blinked. "That's not regulation." "No," Harrison replied. "That's survival." Daniels shrugged. "Fair enough." The B-17s took off as planned. But halfway into the mission, the worst-case scenario arrived. A German fighter wing, 20 aircraft strong, including 2 Me-262 jets, breached the bomber column's right flank. The P-47 swung to intercept. In the chaos, Daniels' Harrisonized Thunderbolt took point. He broke formation with calculated aggression, slicing between 2 attacking FW-190s, taking a few hits to his wing but holding control thanks to the reinforced rudder system. Then he did something insane. He climbed hard, forcing the Me-262s to follow upward into thinner air. That's where the mod paid off. With the modified intake and brace system, Daniels' aircraft didn't choke. It climbed clean with boosted torque and stable cooling. At 19,000 feet, he looped and dived, and nailed one Me-262 with a perfect 3-second burst. The second jet broke off. The bombers were safe. Daniels returned, engine humming, systems intact. His fighter's post-mission check showed stress marks on the new brace, but no failures. Not a single bolt gave way. The crew chief shook his head. It held. A week later, an unofficial memo made its way through the maintenance channels. If Harrison can mod it, let him. Just keep it quiet. This mission proved more than a single fix. It proved that in the hands of a field genius, a fighter could be reborn overnight, not as a copy of factory perfection, but as something deadlier, uglier, and better. And that from behind a pile of junk, one man's tools could rewrite the rules of survival. When the war ended, Europe fell quiet, but the noise of bureaucracy returned in full force. Debriefs were filed, after-action reports reviewed, and the long process of assigning medals, citations, and official credit began. Everyone wanted to tally up what had worked and what had not. The blueprints came back into fashion. Commanders pored over schematics, cross-referenced official mods, and compiled statistics from the factories that had churned out thousands of aircraft. Engineers gave lectures, Designers were praised. Companies were awarded contracts. And Harrison? He returned home with grease under his fingernails, no medals on his chest, and exactly 0 mentions in the public history of the P-47 Thunderbolt. His name was buried in maintenance logs, often next to the word unauthorized. But his fingerprints were everywhere. 27 squadrons had adopted his intake reinforcement. A dozen more had borrowed his intercooler vent system. Over 1,200 sorties were flown using aircraft modified by his techniques, many of those on fighters that had previously been declared unfit for combat. And then there were the kills. No fewer than 19 confirmed enemy aircraft were shot down by Thunderbolts carrying Harrison's field mods. 3 of them, Me-262s, the very aircraft the manuals said couldn't be caught, couldn't be beaten, and certainly couldn't be outflown by a fighter patched together from junkyard steel and American stubbornness. It was never about heroism in the skies alone. It was about the invisible chain of cause and effect. One weld leads to one flight. One flight leads to one kill. One kill saves a squadron. And in Harrison's case, one man in a tent behind a fuel truck altered the balance of air power, not by rank, but by refusal. His greatest contribution wasn't any single part or system. It was a mindset that war couldn't be won solely from behind drafting tables or inside factories. That sometimes, when perfection fails, improvisation saves lives. And perhaps the most symbolic image of all came from a photograph snapped on May 1st, 1945, just days before VE Day. It shows Harrison sitting on an upturned oil drum, torch in hand, grease on his arms, surrounded by 3 aircraft. One of them, unmistakably, is Rusty Demon, scarred, patched, and flying better than ever. On her fuselage, a line of stenciled text reads, "Repaired by EH, trust the ugly ones." That plane flew its final mission 3 days later, intercepted a jet, came back with half a wing missing, but the intake, Harrison's intake, still intact. To this day, no statue stands for Eddie Scrap Harrison. But in every aircraft kept alive by impossible timing, in every jet downed by a fighter that wasn't supposed to fly, his story is welded into the bones of victory. Because in the end, the blueprint wasn't enough. But the man with the blowtorch was. There's a saying among field crews: the pilot gets the medals, the wrench gets the ghosts. No one knew this better than Eddie Scrap Harrison. He didn't ask for applause. He didn't care for rank. He knew where his war was fought. Not in the skies above Europe, but in the dirt behind the hangar, where twisted steel became lifelines, and broken machines were given one more chance to fly. 128 lives. That's the number unofficially attributed to the aircraft Harrison touched. Planes he brought back from the edge with nothing more than junk, grit, and a gift no manual could teach. Some say it's more. Some say it's far less. But the real number was never kills or sorties. The real number was 0, as in 0 times Harrison gave up on a machine that might still fly. In a world that rewarded clean uniforms and clean records, he stayed in the shadows. Blackened boots, smoke-stained hands, and a face lit only by the orange glow of a welding arc. And yet, when the fighters roared to life before dawn, everyone listened for that one sound, the guttural, perfect growl of a Harrison-modded intake catching flame. That sound meant hope. That sound meant someone believed in machines others had given up on. That sound meant survival. When pilots climbed into his aircraft, they didn't salute him. They nodded. Just once, because respect like his wasn't spoken. It was earned under pressure, sealed in steel, and trusted with their lives. He wasn't the hero in the cockpit. He was the reason the cockpit made it home.